I remember that summer night like it was yesterday, even though it's been years. We were deep in the woods, far from any city lights or sounds, just a small clearing surrounded by towering pines and oaks. The air was crisp, the kind of cool that makes you pull your jacket tighter around you, and the fire crackled bright and alive, casting flickering shadows that danced on the trunks and leaves. My friends and I had gathered there, all of us sprawled on logs and blankets, eager to share scary stories to pass the time until dawn. The smell of pine needles mixed with the faint scent of smoke, and the only other sounds were the occasional hoot of an owl and the rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze. It was the perfect setup for a night of eerie tales. I was the one who kicked things off. I told them about a hiker who vanished under the strangest circumstances, and the story gripped everyone right away. This wasn't just some urban legend I heard on a podcast. It was a true account from a local ranger I once met during a summer job. The hiker, a man named Mark, had been exploring a rarely traveled trail deep in the same forest we were in now. According to the ranger, Mark was an experienced outdoorsman, never the type to panic or get lost. But one afternoon, he reported hearing whispers coming from the trees around him, soft, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to float on the wind. At first, he thought it was other hikers or maybe animals, but as the whispers grew louder and more persistent, he grew uneasy. Mark's last known radio transmission was strange. He described the whispers as calling his name, urging him to follow deeper into the woods. Then the signal cut out abruptly. Search parties combed the area for days but found no trace of him, no footprints, no torn branches, nothing except his abandoned backpack left at the edge of a small clearing. The ranger told me that locals whispered the forest was cursed, that something ancient watched from the shadows, luring people in with voices only the trees could carry. When I finished, the fire seemed to burn a little lower, and the night grew still. My friends sat in silence, the tension thick between us, eyes fixed on the dark woods that surrounded our campsite. Then Sarah broke the silence, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's terrifying," she said, pulling her knees closer to her chest. "Do you think something like that could happen here?" I shrugged, not wanting to admit I felt a shiver crawl down my spine. The woods around us suddenly felt less like a playground and more like a trap. We tried to shake off the unease with jokes and laughter, but the mood had shifted. That's when I started on the second story, another true tale, but this one carried its own kind of dread. It was about a group of campers who stayed overnight at a remote site not far from here. When they woke up the next morning, they found strange symbols etched into their tents, jagged, twisting shapes that looked like some kind of ancient script. The campers didn't know what to make of it at first, but as the day went on, they started noticing other signs, claw marks on the trees, disturbed earth around their fire pit, and an overwhelming feeling of being watched. They packed up and left immediately, but the symbols remained a mystery. Some said the marks were warnings, or maybe a message from something that lived just beyond the edge of the firelight. As I spoke, I could see my friends' faces growing more serious. The fire's glow flickered across their features, casting long shadows that made their eyes look hollow and wide. The forest seemed to lean closer, every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves setting off a jolt of adrenaline. I wasn't sure if it was the stories or the darkness playing tricks on us, but the woods felt alive, like they were listening. Then came the third story, the one about the lost child. This was the one that got under everyone's skin the most. It was said that on certain nights, if you listened closely, you could hear the ghostly cries of a child echoing through the woods. The tale was about a boy who had wandered away from his family during a camping trip years ago and was never found. People claimed to have heard his sobbing near the edge of the forest, a sound so real and heart-wrenching that it brought grown men to tears. Some even said they'd seen a fleeting glimpse of a small figure standing just beyond the tree line, staring back with eyes full of sorrow. The group fell completely silent after I finished that one. The crackling fire seemed impossibly loud in the stillness, and the shadows deepened as the flames flickered. I could feel the weight of the forest pressing in around us, the cool night wrapping its fingers tighter like a shroud. Even the stars above seemed dimmer, as if the darkness was swallowing their light. I glanced around at my friends, their faces pale, their eyes darting nervously toward the dark woods. The stories had drawn us in, each one building on the last, weaving a tapestry of fear that felt all too real. The forest wasn't just a backdrop anymore. It was a character in its own right, mysterious and ancient, holding secrets that refused to be uncovered. We all sat closer to the fire, the warmth suddenly feeling like a fragile barrier against whatever lurked beyond the circle of light. The whispers from the first story echoed in my mind, the symbols from the second seemed to appear faintly in the flickering shadows, and the lost child's cries felt almost within reach, carried on the night breeze. It was a night that felt suspended between the real and the unreal, where the line between story and truth blurred into something far more chilling. No one wanted to be the first to break the silence, but the tension was undeniable. We were bound together by the stories, by the shared shiver that ran down our spines, and by the dark woods that seemed to watch and wait. And as the fire crackled low, I knew this was only the beginning. The forest had more stories to tell, and we were about to hear them all. The firelight flickered as shadows stretched and shifted around us, the woods pressing in tighter with every passing minute. After the silence that followed the lost child's tale, I could tell the unease was settling deeper into the group. No one spoke at first, but the tension was thick enough to cut through. Sarah finally broke the quiet, her voice trembling as she asked if I had more stories. I nodded, feeling the weight of their anticipation, and dove into the next two tales, stories that only escalated the sense of dread, pulling us further into the forest's dark heart. The second story was about a pair of campers who had stayed at a site not far from here, a spot they'd picked because it was secluded and peaceful. They were two friends, both used to the wilderness, confident they could handle whatever nature threw their way. But when they woke the next morning, they found their tents had been vandalized in a way that made their skin crawl, strange symbols, carved deep into the fabric with something sharp and jagged. The shapes were unlike any language they'd seen, twisted, almost alive, as if they pulsed with some sinister meaning. The campers were rattled, but they chalked it up to some prankster or local kids messing around. But that wasn't all. As they packed up, they noticed claw marks on nearby trees, gouged deep into the bark in irregular patterns. The marks formed no clear shape, but the sheer size and ferocity suggested something big and wild. They also found the ground around their fire pit had been disturbed, as if something had been digging or pacing in circles overnight. Most unsettling of all was the feeling of being watched, an oppressive presence that clung to the air like fog. The friends left immediately, but the symbols remained etched into their memories, haunting them long after the trip ended. As I told the story, I saw my friends shift uneasily. The firelight caught the glint of fear in their eyes, and the branches overhead seemed to whisper along with my words. The forest felt alive with secrets, as if it knew the stories and wanted to remind us we were intruders in its domain. Then I moved on to the third story, the one about the lost child's ghostly cries that echoed through the woods. This story was different because it wasn't just about strange marks or disappearances. It was about something unbearably human, a lingering sorrow that refused to fade. According to locals, on certain nights, if you listened closely enough, you could hear the sobbing of a child carried on the wind. Not just any child, but a boy who had vanished years ago during a family camping trip. Search parties had scoured the forest, but he was never found. Some believed his spirit was trapped here, forever wandering the trees, searching for a way home. People who lived nearby said the cries weren't always distant. Some claimed they'd seen a small figure standing just beyond the firelight, a boy with tear-streaked cheeks and eyes full of pain. Others reported hearing footsteps behind them when no one was there, or feeling a cold breath on the back of their neck. It was the kind of story that left you looking over your shoulder long after the sun had risen. The group was quiet again after I finished, the firelight seeming dimmer, the night colder. The stories weren't just tales anymore, they were warnings etched into the fabric of the forest itself. I noticed hands gripping marshmallow sticks a little tighter, eyes flicking nervously toward the tree-line, and the way the shadows seemed to lengthen as if reaching for us. Curious, Emily asked if there were any explanations for these things, if anyone had tried to understand what was really going on. I nodded and leaned in, lowering my voice. The forest, I explained, is steeped in local legends that go back generations. Some say the woods are haunted by spirits who never left, bound by tragedy or anger. Others believe there are creatures lurking just beyond human perception, beings that can manipulate the mind, whispering in the dark and twisting reality. One particularly chilling legend tells of an ancient guardian of the forest, a shadowy figure who watches over the trees and punishes those who disrespect the land. The symbols from the campers' tents, some say, are warnings left by this guardian or its followers, a way to mark trespassers or those who disturb the balance. The whispers the hiker heard? Some believe they're the guardian's voice, calling out to lead the unwary deeper into the woods, never to return. As I spoke, the fire flickered wildly, casting grotesque shapes on the nearby trees. Every crackle sounded like a footstep, every gust of wind like a whisper. The forest around us was no longer just a backdrop. It was an active participant, watching and waiting. We all felt it, the creeping dread that set in when stories aren't just stories anymore. The kind of fear that seeps into your bones and makes you question what's real. I could see it in my friends' faces, nervous glances exchanged, breaths held when a branch snapped, the way they instinctively moved closer to the fire. Then, almost on cue, a rustling came from the edge of the clearing. Everyone froze. It was subtle at first, a soft brush of leaves, barely audible over the fire's crackle. But then it grew louder, a series of snaps and scrapes that seemed to circle around us just beyond the firelight. No one moved, but our hearts pounded in unison, the silence between us thick with fear. I swallowed hard and whispered that it was probably just an animal, maybe a deer or raccoon, but even my voice sounded shaky. The woods had become something else, alive with unseen eyes and silent watchers. We didn't speak for a while after that. Instead, we sat in silence, the fire our only anchor against the encroaching dark. The stories we'd shared hung in the air like a dense fog, thickening the night and making every shadow a potential threat. The forest was no longer a place to explore but a place to respect, to fear. As the night wore on, the fire flickered lower, and the cold seeped deeper into our bones. Our group huddled closer, instinctively seeking comfort in numbers. The earlier laughter and bravado were gone, replaced by a shared understanding that the woods held secrets far darker than we'd imagined. Occasionally, a twig snapped or a branch rustled, sending jolts through us. Each noise felt like a message, a reminder that the forest was watching, waiting. The shadows played tricks on our eyes, and every rustle seemed to carry a whisper of those ancient voices, calling out from the depths. It was in those moments that I realized the stories weren't just entertainment. They were a way of passing down warnings, a way to keep people safe by reminding them of the forest's power. The symbols etched into tents, the ghostly cries, the unseen guardian, these were all pieces of a puzzle that told us to tread carefully. But despite the fear, there was a strange pull, a fascination that kept us rooted to the spot. We wanted to understand, to glimpse the truth behind the tales. The forest was a living storybook, full of mysteries waiting to be uncovered. And so we listened closely, hearts pounding, waiting for whatever came next. The fire had dwindled to a few glowing embers when I began the fourth story, and the night had thickened into a suffocating blackness that pressed against us from all sides. The woods around us felt different now, alive, almost sentient, as if the very trees were holding their breath. I glanced at my friends, their faces pale and eyes wide, reflecting the faint glow of the dying fire. No one wanted to break the spell, but they were hanging on every word. This next story was the most chilling of all, the one that left me unsettled long after I first heard it. It was about a figure, an apparition, or maybe something else, seen lurking just beyond the firelight in these very woods. Locals called it the Watcher, a shadowy presence that moved silently through the trees, always observing but never revealing itself fully. Those who claimed to have seen it said it stood motionless, just watching with unblinking eyes, then vanished without a trace when confronted. The story began with a group of friends camping near a remote part of the forest. Like us, they gathered around a fire, sharing stories and laughter late into the night. But as the hours passed, one of them noticed a figure standing just beyond the circle of light, a tall, dark silhouette that didn't move or make a sound. At first, they thought it was someone playing a prank, but when they called out, the figure disappeared. They searched the surrounding trees but found nothing. The feeling of being watched lingered, growing heavier with each passing minute. Things took a terrifying turn when strange noises erupted from the woods, low growls, breaking branches, and whispers too faint to understand. Panic set in, and the friends scrambled to gather their gear, their calm shattered by the unknown presence outside the firelight. The story ended with one of them stepping into the darkness alone, despite desperate warnings, and never being seen again. The only trace left behind was a blood-curdling scream that echoed through the forest, chilling the bones of everyone who heard it. As I spoke, the night seemed to close in tighter. The fire sputtered, sending a cascade of sparks into the air, and every rustle of leaves sounded like footsteps just beyond the edge of the light. I could see the tension coil in my friends' bodies, the way they clutched their blankets, the quick, shallow breaths, the darting glances toward the shadowed woods. Just as I finished, a sudden snap of a branch shattered the silence. We all froze, staring into the darkness where the firelight faded into blackness. The noise came again, this time closer, deliberate. It was as if something was moving just beyond our vision, watching and waiting. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin. Emily whispered, "Did you hear that?" Her voice trembled, barely audible over the pounding of our hearts. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "It's probably just an animal," I said, though I wasn't convinced. The stories had made every sound feel like a signal, every shadow like a lurking threat. Suddenly, a faint, eerie noise drifted through the trees, a sound unlike anything we'd heard before. It was a scream, sharp and agonizing, cutting through the night air and freezing us in place. The sound echoed off the trunks, fading slowly into silence. No one moved, the weight of that scream hanging between us like a shroud. Panic rose quickly after that. We scrambled to pack up the fire, grabbing blankets and backpacks with shaking hands. Every rustle seemed magnified, every flicker of movement just beyond the firelight sending jolts of fear through us. The forest had shifted from a place of stories to a place of real danger. As we hurried to gather our things, I caught a glimpse of something just beyond the glow, a shadow slipping between the trees, watching us silently. It was gone before anyone else saw it, but the memory burned into my mind. The watcher was real, and it was close. The friends around me were pale and wide-eyed, their earlier bravado replaced by raw fear. We stuck close together, voices hushed as we debated whether to stay or try to make it back to camp. None of us wanted to be alone in the dark woods after that scream. I remember the cold seeping into my bones as we moved cautiously, every step crunching on dry leaves, every breath visible in the frigid air. The forest seemed endless, a maze of shadows and silent watchers. The stories we'd shared weren't just tales, they were warnings, and we were now caught in the middle of one. The final story I told that night was the one that left the deepest scar. It was about a camper who ignored every warning, who ventured alone into the darkness despite the desperate pleas of friends. The man was last seen stepping beyond the firelight, drawn by something irresistible, something that called to him in whispers. His disappearance was sudden and complete, no trace of him ever found, just a blood-curdling scream that shattered the night and a chilling warning left behind. As I recounted this tale, the fire was nothing but a smoldering heap, and the cold wrapped around us like a suffocating blanket. The woods seemed to close in, the shadows thick and impenetrable. The feeling of being watched was no longer a story. It was a presence pressing against our skin, making every hair stand on end. The group huddled closer, the bravado and curiosity of earlier hours replaced by a shared, unspoken terror. The silence stretched on, broken only by the occasional crack of a branch or the distant call of an owl, each sound magnified in the stillness. I looked around at my friends, their faces pale and strained, eyes flickering toward the darkness as if expecting the watcher to step into the firelight at any moment. The stories had woven a web around us, drawing us deep into the forest's secrets and fears. Despite the fear, there was a strange bond between us now, a connection forged in the shared experience of the night's tales and the creeping dread that surrounded us. We knew the forest held mysteries we couldn't understand, and that some stories were more than just stories. We didn't speak much after that, the weight of silence pressing down as the fire finally died, leaving us in near darkness. We stayed close, watching the blackness beyond the fire's reach, waiting and wondering what else might be lurking just out of sight. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, every whisper of wind set our nerves on edge. The forest was no longer just a backdrop for stories. It was an active, watching force. And as the night dragged on, I realized that some warnings are meant to be heeded, some shadows left unexplored. That night changed us. We had stepped into a story far older and darker than anything we could have imagined, and the forest had made sure we knew it. As the first light of dawn crept softly through the trees, the fire long since reduced to cold ash, I found myself staring into the thinning darkness with a lingering unease that refused to fade. The night's stories still hung heavy in the air, their shadows stretching far beyond the circle of embers that had once kept us company. We sat quietly, each of us lost in thought, the raw fear and mystery woven through those tales settling deep within our bones. It was strange. Even as the sun began to warm the forest floor, the weight of the night's events didn't lift. Instead, it seemed to settle around us like a cloak, a reminder that some campfire stories aren't just fiction spun to entertain. They're born from real terror, from unexplained phenomena that ripple through time and space in places like these woods. We all shared a silent understanding. These stories carried a truth that went beyond the eerie images and whispered warnings. They were warnings themselves, passed down from those who had glimpsed the forest's darker side and lived to tell the tale. I looked around at my friends, their faces still pale, eyes flickering with the memory of what we'd shared. The usual morning chatter was subdued, replaced by glances exchanged in quiet acknowledgement. We had been drawn together by fear and fascination, bound by the stories and the night's intangible presence. There was a solemn respect now, a cautious wariness of the forest that surrounded us. We began to pack up slowly, the silence only broken by the rustling of tents and the soft crunch of footsteps on the leaf-strewn ground. The woods themselves seemed quieter now, the earlier restless energy replaced by a stillness that felt almost reverent. It was as if the forest had settled back into its natural rhythm, holding its secrets close once more. As we worked, I thought about the people behind these stories, the hiker who vanished after hearing the whispers, the campers who woke to find strange symbols etched into their tents, the whispers of a lost child's cries carried on the wind, and the shadowy figure known only as the Watcher. They weren't just characters in a tale. They were real lives touched by something beyond understanding. Their experiences had been passed down to us, woven into the fabric of the woods like an unbroken chain of fear and caution. The stories reminded me that some places hold memories that refuse to fade, where the line between past and present blurs. The forest wasn't just a collection of trees and shadows. It was a living archive of those who'd come before, a place where the unseen watched and waited. We couldn't pretend the night hadn't changed us. It had, in ways that went beyond mere fright. As we gathered our final belongings, I felt a strange mixture of relief and reluctance. Relief that the night was over, that the sun was rising and the darkness receding. But reluctance too, because something about the forest's mysteries had taken hold of me, a fascination that was hard to shake. I knew I'd carry these stories with me, retelling them with the same reverence and fear, hoping to keep the warnings alive. Before we left, we stood once more in the clearing, looking out into the forest that had been both our setting and our antagonist. The trees stood tall and silent, their leaves rustling softly in the morning breeze. For a moment, it felt like the woods were watching us back, a silent acknowledgement that the stories weren't finished, that the forest still held its secrets close. We left the clearing with heavy hearts and cautious steps, each of us carrying a piece of the night with us. The woods behind us faded into the distance, but the memory of what we'd shared lingered. The stories had become part of us now, not just campfire tales, but real warnings etched into our minds. Even now, when I think back to that night, a shiver runs down my spine. The forest may seem peaceful in daylight, but I know better. I know that beneath the calm exterior lies something ancient and watchful, something that has seen countless nights like the one we endured. The stories we told were more than entertainment. They were a reminder of the thin veil that separates the known from the unknown. And sometimes, when the wind rustles through the trees just right, I swear I can still hear the faintest whisper, a voice carried on the breeze, calling out from the shadows, urging caution, warning those who listen that some stories are true, and that some woods are best left unexplored.